Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Venda Premkumar. I'm an English teacher, and I'm also the Joint District and Branch Secretary for Redbridge National Education Union. Thank you so much for joining this NEU Fringe meeting tonight. We are live streaming on YouTube and on Facebook as well. You can participate in the meeting by posting questions and comments in the chat. And if I get a chance, I will try to read out some of those comments. At tonight's meeting, we will be discussing how do we fight for an anti-racist education, especially in light of the Race Commission report. We all know society is hungry for social change. The felling of the Edward Colston statue shows us that. The protest, the very inspiring protest by the Pimlico Academy students against racist uniform policy also shows that. And as educators, like myself, we are refusing to propagate the dominant narrative of white supremacy by embracing the decolonizing agenda. The only people who do not seem to want change are the ones in the government. So what do we do? Well, let's hear from our first speaker on his thoughts. That is Courtney, the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. You're very welcome, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Venda. And I'm really pleased to be on this platform, Fringe meeting at NEU conference. I wish we were together in person, but really pleased to be here with Professor Gus John, my own MP, Diane Abbott, and other fantastic speakers. During this last tumultuous year, we have seen such clear examples of racial injustice highlighted by the pandemic and by the Black Lives Matter movement. For example, more than 9 in 10 doctors who've died of COVID in the UK are from Black and brown minorities. Never forget those photos from the start of the pandemic. The BMA says that Black and brown doctors often feel bullied and harassed at higher levels compared to their white counterparts. They're twice as likely not to raise concerns because of fear of recrimination. Now, the Sewell report was meant to examine these racial disparities, but it sought instead to explain them away. Now, our union, the NEU, has responded along with other unions, with the Runnymede Trust, with so many people to this report. With the Runnymede Trust, we addressed the Prime Minister directly. We told him that we reject the findings of the Independent Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. And we said to him that if he and his government are genuinely committed to acknowledging and addressing the issue of racial equity, then we call on him to repudiate the Commission's findings and to withdraw this report. I think that's a demand we should make widely. The report is being criticised. We want that criticism to grow. We want the government to back away from it. The report has a callous disregard for the very real racial injustice exposed by this last tumultuous year. The Sewell report says about Grenfell and the Windrush scandal, outcomes such as these do not come about by design and are certainly not deliberately targeted. How can you not see the Windrush scandal as prima facie an example of people being targeted because of the colour of their skin? How can you not see the persistent and long-term ignoring of concerns raised by the predominantly Black families who lived in the Grenfell Tower and not see that as an example of institutional racism? And I think it's particularly shameful that the Sewell report is published just preceding the 28th anniversary of the murder of Stephen Lawrence on the 22nd of April, 1993. The Macpherson report found institutional racism in the police and implicated other bodies. That report has led to forward movement. And that report is the product of struggle, in particular, in that case, by the heroic struggle of Stephen's family, by his mum, Doreen, by his dad, Neville, by so many others supporting them. Struggle leads to forward movement. This report wants to take us back to the 1970s in its denial of institutional racism. It implies that anyone who speaks about racism is stuck in the past. We have to reiterate our commitment to speak and act on racism. We're going to mark in the NEU, we're going to mark Stephen Lawrence Day with a webinar on Black history. The Sewell report actually also fails to acknowledge the intersection of race and class and gender. The other intersectionalities in our country is one of the richest in the world, but 30% of our children, black and white, are trapped in poverty. The equivalent of 9 pupils in every class being let down. Poverty does have a significant impact on the educational experience and attainment of children growing up in the UK. And there's a strong link between that and outcomes, stronger than in other countries. But our work shows that approximately 45% of black children are living in poverty. So it's a greater proportion of black children. So we think this is worth saying, and the Sewell report tries to undermine this. It is true that black children often face 2 obstacles, one racism, the other poverty. But far from using this to say racism doesn't matter, as this report does, that truth that children are affected by both racism and poverty should be a clarion call to act on both. And this government is failing on both. It's disingenuous, it's misleading to seek to divide black working class communities and white working class communities. It's class and race both, and we say black and white unite and fight. But racism and its effects are real. The research by the TUC shows that the unemployment rate for Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi groups is 10% higher than for white groups, and that for black, African, Caribbean groups, they're more than twice as likely to be unemployed as white counterparts. But bearing down on unemployment would help working class white people too, because poorer white people are much more likely to be unemployed than better off ones. But you see that the effect of racism strongly in education and on young people. 9 out of 10 children on remand are from black, Asian or minority ethnic backgrounds, according to the Howard Lead for Penal Reform. Exclusion rates for black Caribbean students 6 times higher than white peers in some local authorities. The same for Gypsy, Roma, traveller children. Race disparities in education are ongoing, and you can see them in the issues around retention and progression of black staff, increasing incidents of racial harassment and bullying, and those disproportionate exclusions. And you see those effects then working there through in other ways. A disproportionate presence of black people in the prison system. These figures are simply outrageous. They should be presenting a call to action on race and poverty both. So what does the Sewell report say about education? What recommendations does it make? No recommendations on exclusions. The Sewell report just supports the widely criticised Timpson report. Even more galling, the report has no recommendations on tackling racism in schools. So let's talk about things that could be done. We wrote to the Prime Minister last June. After we had a big meeting with Jesse Jackson as part of the Black Lives Matter upsurge. We wrote to the Prime Minister. We said, review the curriculum to ensure it embraces the fact that Britain is rooted in Black and global history, achievement and culture, and includes the achievement of Black Britons. We said, as recommended by the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. We said, commit to review initial teacher training to equip all trainee teachers with anti-racist strategies and tools for the benefit of all students. We said, adopt a strategy to make the pipeline of new entrants to the teaching profession significantly more diverse over the next 4 years. We said, learn from the Windrush Review, develop a Department for Education plan to teach about the history of the UK and its relationship to the rest of the world, not whitewashing the slave trade, but looking at looking at Britain's colonial history, the history of migration. We said provide immediate advice to employers in the education sector about the pandemic. And we've also demanded action on poverty. Expand the free school meal scheme for every child whose family is in receipt of universal credit. Expand it for every school holiday. Reform school uniform policies. Let's have access for all children, poor children, black and white, to the World Wide Web, to those connections they need. There is so much that could be done. The Sewell report turns away from the actions that we need to take. The NEU is not turning away from those actions. Thank you very much for inviting me to be at this meeting tonight.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That was excellent. Thank you very much. I'm just going to read out a few comments that we've received. Fayaz Rashid said, well said, Kevin, Courtney. Another comment from Ian Sandbrook is, good for you to tell it like it is, Kevin. And another comment from Simon says, they distract and divide us working class people, so that we do not unite to campaign for better wages and living standards. So we need to do the complete opposite. Brilliant, thank you very much. Just to let you know, we have over 300 people watching on Facebook and on YouTube currently. Okay, we're going to be moving on to our second speaker. It is Diane Abbott, MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington. When you're ready, Diane.
Thank you very much, Venda. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very good. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here at this important Fringe, and it couldn't be a more important subject: how we can meet the challenge of giving both Black and white working class children the type and the quality of education they deserve, and how we can build a genuinely anti-racist education system. The first thing to say is, I think the British education system has been failing numbers of working class children almost since the inception of universal education in the 19th century. And it's certainly been failing Black minority ethnic children for at least 2 generations. All too often, when you read about, when you research what's happening, it's almost as if Black and brown children were written off by the school system, particularly, I might say, Black boys. And as for the Sewell Commission, let's be clear, that commission wasn't drawn up for Black and brown people. It wasn't drawn up for people who are on this call. It was drawn up to appeal to people, and I'll put this as politely as I can, it was drawn up to appeal to people who are not as keen on racial justice as they might be. And it was also drawn up to try and take the debate on race back decades, and to make the argument, which is an argument which a lot of the people around Boris, not to mention Boris himself, really believe, that there is no such thing as institutional racism. So in this context, in this really brazen pushback against racial justice in society, how do we construct a genuinely anti-racist education? Well, I think the Sewell Commission's major recommendation in education is that we should have longer school days. I mean, it's extraordinary. If you are in a system which is institutionally biased against working class children and Black children, it doesn't matter how long the school day is, those children are not going to achieve their full potential. So how do you make sure that all children in our school system achieve their full potential? Well, first of all, obviously, you need to put the funding in. And we know with austerity and under this Tory government that schools are struggling in relation to funding and staff. We also need, in relation to race, to actually keep some data. It's extraordinary to me, decades after I first started looking into this issue, that you still can't easily get the data on how many Black minority ethnic children there are in schools, there are in specific boroughs, and you still can't get the data on achievement. But if you can't count something, if you don't admit something's an issue, you're not going to make progress on it. The other thing, apart from keeping data, is to look at our curriculum. And one of the people I'm very keen to hear from in this event is the pupil from Pimlico School, because they have raised issues of cultural literacy in their own school. It's about having a curriculum that talks about British history in its totality. And its totality does mean empire, it does mean colonialism, and it does mean slavery. And it means a little bit more than just saying, oh, Wilberforce freed the slaves. It means actually making it clear how Black people and former slaves fought and campaigned and argued for their freedom. So you want proper data. You want a culturally literate curriculum that talks about British history in its entirety and talks about the culture and the writing of the communities that some of our children in our schools come from, and gives that culture and writing honour and gives that culture and writing legitimacy, so those children feel that they are affirmed. The other thing you need to make sure that all our children achieve what they should achieve is you need more Black and minority teachers. That is not to say that only Black and minority teachers can teach Black and minority children, but it is to say that overall, in our big diverse cities like London, Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow, you should have a teaching workforce that looks like the children they are trying to teach. Having a more balanced teaching workforce actually helps everybody, and in particular helps to make sure that we have a culturally literate curriculum and that it's as possible as it can be to reach out to the parents of Black and ethnic minority children. And finally, what you have to do if you want a genuinely anti-racist school curriculum is you have to bear down on exclusions. There's a man called Martin Neri, who used to be Director General of Prison Service, but then went on to run Barnardo's. And he said, on the day you exclude a child from school, you might as well give them a date and time to turn up at prison. We have to disrupt that pipeline from school failure to the criminal justice system. And we have to bear down on exclusions. These are not new issues. Getting the data, a culturally literate curriculum, more Black and minority teachers, bearing down on exclusions are not new issues. They've been issues, as some of you on the same call with me can tell you, have been issues for 30 years. But this is the kinds of things we should be focused on, not a longer school day. We need to be talking about the content of that school day. We need to be talking about how we reach out to parents. We need to talk about the teachers we have, and we need to talk about what they teach. So the Sewell Commission, I mean, you feel a little bit sorry for the commissioners because many of these commissioners are now backing off the commission because it overreached. You don't have to be a social justice warrior to know that you have institutional racism in many of our British institutions. And it's extraordinary that a commissioner was looking at disparities, racial disparities, didn't mention the immigration system at all. And if there's one part of government which is a textbook case of institutional racism, it is our immigration and asylum system. But of course they wouldn't mention that because that would undermine their case for saying institutional racism doesn't exist. The Windrush generation that came to this country in the 50s, they knew it would be tough. It was an era before you had race legislation. You could discriminate against people, you could pay them less, you could exclude them from certain professions altogether. They knew it would be tough, but they believed that for their children and their grandchildren, it would be better. And the means by which they thought it would be better was education. That early generation has been let down, but working with committed teachers and community activists and school students, like the school students from Pimlico we're going to hear from, we can begin to learn from what has gone wrong and build a genuinely anti-racist school system. It's what Black children and minority children deserve, it's what white children deserve, and it's what the society deserves. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was excellent suggestions there. Okay, I'm just going to move on to our third speaker, who is Reem Kadhim. Reem is one of the Pimlico Academy students who organised the protest and walkout at their school over the racist uniform policy. Very excited to have you here, Reem. So when you're ready.
Thank you for having me. So starting in September, we were introduced to a new head teacher. And with this new head teacher, we were also introduced to a bunch of new policies which were quite discriminatory towards certain groups, such as you cannot have hairstyles that obstruct people's views, which were clearly aimed to penalise those with Afro haircuts. There were other policies as well, such as no facial hair, which would discriminate against Sikhs. The headscarf rule, you had to either cover all of your hair or not at all. And it's not like this protest just came out of nowhere. This was built up frustration and anger from the fact that we weren't being listened to when we did raise our concerns about this. I myself had actually approached the head teacher myself in September, and I told him these policies, especially the one about the Afro, people are calling them racist. What do you have to say about this? And I was dismissed immediately. I was given a one-sentence answer before he walked away, and that was, we have more important things to talk about in 2020. Racism isn't an important thing to talk about, especially in 2020 when the Black Lives Matter protest had just passed after the murder of George Floyd. What was especially outrageous as well was the number of incidents of racism within the school itself. There was a case, for example, where a boy in the lower years had created a group chat called Black Lives Don't Matter, and he had added a bunch of students into that group. And that wasn't responded to appropriately to the boy directly or to educate the school further. Another boy had proudly stated that he was a white supremacist, and again, nothing was done about this. The fact that I had to sit in that meeting during the protests and ask them to do assemblies and PSHE lessons where they will mention racism, Black history, Islamophobia, etc. I had to sit there and ask them to give us the bare minimum. Normally, I would be outraged that we're only getting 30 minutes a week mentioning racism, but we weren't even getting that. And many have told me, oh, but we're an academy, and so they don't have to stick to the national curriculum. But isn't that more reason for you to introduce more diversity within the curriculum? You aren't confined to what the national curriculum says that you have to do, but instead we have stripped even more away from us. The curriculum that we are given does not reflect its students whatsoever. We are the ones that are being taught, and we need to feel as though we are being taught something that could actually help us, that actually reflects us. Coincidentally, the protest actually happened on the same day that the Sewell report came out, and bouncing off of what Kevin said, it actually, instead of, we don't need to be having these discussions. We don't need to be debating on whether institutional racism exists or doesn't. We know it exists, right? So them saying that, oh, it doesn't exist, they're actually trying to switch the narrative in order to not take blame or not have to face up to their mistakes. They are denying its existence. And the fact that they put people such as Tony Sewell and Black and Asian ethnic minorities to put forth this report, it's kind of like they're going, see, we're not saying it, they are. Black people are saying it, so of course it doesn't exist. To end off, the best thing for me that I feel that came out of the protest that happened on Wednesday was not the promise for the direct change that's going to happen within Pimlico, but the way that the news of it has spread so far and wide, and it could potentially inspire other students that they could stand up to what they see wrong within their own schools. I think many young people, like myself, underestimate their own power and the power that you have within numbers, especially in protest. There is power in protest, and I think Pimlico Academy showed that very well. And if you're seeing problems, minor problems and huge problems such as institutional racism, which definitely exists, my school is a prime example of it, stand up to it. You aren't too little, too small. Your voice does matter, and if they're not listening, make them listen, just like we did. Thank you.
Wow, such inspiring, powerful words from you, Reem. Thank you so much. I've got lots of comments here from listeners who are watching. Solidarity to the Pimlico students, they are an inspiration, says Janet. I've got a comment from Sasha who says, Reem and the pupils of Pimlico are an inspiration. So I think the word inspiration is definitely, being used about you guys. I think it's really difficult to kind of overstate just how what your protest has achieved. I think it's given lots of inspiration for not just students but teachers as well, who aren't often in a position to speak out about these things. But I think your actions have definitely inspired not just students but teachers and educators as well. I have incidentally got a message from your teachers at your school from the NEU group. So I'm just going to take a minute to read out a statement from the Pimlico Academy NEU group. The Pimlico Academy NEU expresses solidarity with the concerns of the students that gave rise to Wednesday's demonstration and is proud of the mature and responsible way in which they have handled themselves all throughout the day. On Tuesday, the 30th of March, NEU members held a vote of no confidence in the leadership of Daniel Smith. The vast majority of NEU members took part and the vote passed by 99%. Members are concerned about the leadership's failure to address accusations of racism that have brought the Academy into disrepute, poor and unprofessional communication, unacceptable management style, and failure to ensure the safety of staff and pupils. NEU members feel these issues prevent them from properly exercising their duty of care and adversely impact staff and student well-being. That was from the Pimlico NEU group. So, it's fantastic to see students and staff standing together, shoulder to shoulder, to challenge racism. Thank you very much, Reem, for taking the time out to be here. Okay, now to our next speaker, who is Professor Gus John, award-winning writer and education campaigner. Very welcome, Gus.
Thank you very much, and thank you, NEU, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be able to join you at this conference, and particularly at this very bizarre time. I want to share a few thoughts, and I shall get to it straight away. The first thing I want to say is this, that even if no one had come from the former colonies to the UK since the Second World War, Britain would have still needed to help its population understand what it had done across the globe for centuries and how the legacy of empire, the racism that it spawned, and embedded notions of white supremacy were impacting upon them their sense of nationhood and of white identity. That it would have been impossible to do that, and it still is today, because Britain remains in denial of the historical fact that British identity has increasingly been shaped by racism and imperialism. And that's not just in the past. Britain's ongoing presence on the world stage and the anachronism of Queen Elizabeth II as the head of the Commonwealth means that the reality of Britain's imperialist past and the way that shaped the world should have been impacting much more visibly on the purpose of schooling and education, the content of curriculum, and the practice of pedagogy. That this is still an almost totally neglected, if not rejected, agenda because of the nativism and the insistence of seeing African and global majority people, that's my substitute for BAME, by the way, as not belonging, not British, and therefore as having no automatic right to determine and shape the future of multi-ethnic Britain as white Brits are automatically assumed to have. That the narrative about schooling outcomes and the persistence of racism in schooling and education still projects British-born African and global majority people as immigrant outsiders who happen to be in our schools and universities by accident of birth, and therefore as having no entitlement to shape the future of the country or determine what the content and orientation of schooling should be. Hence the preoccupation, as Kevin was saying, with why they, people like me, are doing better than our own white working class students. The subtext of which, of course, is that schooling was systematically racist, and if it was systematically racist, as can't remember his name even, Sewell is arguing, then white working class children would not be doing worse than Black children. A nasty, even racist piece of reductionism that does nobody on that commission any good. Based upon all of the above assumptions and beliefs, the likes of Gove, Williamson, Gibbs, etc., and that Grand Master of House Slaves, Tony Sewell, could see no need to decolonize the curriculum, let alone decolonize the institution of school, as Reem was alluding to a while ago, and the institution of university. Nothing gladdened my heart more this year, since the beginning of January, than to see students at Pimlico taking collective action, irrespective of ethnicity and religion and belief, against the discrimination and exclusion that is built into that school's policies. And that, by the way, is a replica of far too many others. Policies which are geared towards creating and sustaining a neoliberal corporate ethos and preparing a future workforce based upon what corporate business is expected to want of workers. So messing about with issues such as length and color of hair, color of clothes, including hijabs, choices of association, choices of language used in friendship groups. For example, in some schools, insisting on the use of standard English at all times, irrespective of who you're talking to. In other words, a totally warped definition of what is to be tolerated and the application of repressive zero-tolerance policies that generate an obscenely disproportionate number of exclusions and the wrecking of young people's lives and life chances. That, therefore, an anti-racist education system must be built on a schooling system that defines the ultimate purpose of schooling and education as being to humanize society and promote social justice and racial justice, not to promote and recycle elitism and widen social and economic divisions in society. that we need to take a stand, as Diane was saying, on nil exclusions and have a system that is governed by a nil exclusions policy, and one that demonstrates that every child does matter. A policy backed up by resources to address children's complex needs, including the staffing to make that possible. A system that outlaws the handing out of behavior points like confetti, even for the most insignificant of infractions, typically as a substitute for talking with young people, allowing them a voice, and applying respect and common sense in your interactions with them. A system that teaches all children about Britain's imperialist past and colonial present. One that connects the current and future generations of school students with the way British post-war history was made, including the movement of populations, the racialization and racist manipulation of immigration, the growth and objectives of social movements, globalization, the decline of industrialization, the exponential growth of new technology, and the likely consequences of the rapid growth of artificial intelligence. A schooling system that genuinely enables all students to be comfortable in their own skin, to respect and deal fairly and justly with those who don't look like them, and to develop a vision of the society they must build together for their own future and that of generations coming after them.
Thank you, Gus. If you could sum up.
I will sum up. 35 years ago, I delivered a paper at a rally at Conway Hall. Kevin, I'm sure, would remember it well. Organized by teachers in London against the retrograde policies of Keith Joseph, then Education Secretary. The paper was called The Black Working Class Movement in Education and Schooling and the 1985-86 Teachers' Dispute. In that paper, I presented the position of the Black Parents Movement, of which I was a founding member, on whose behalf I spoke. That position being that independent parents' power and independent students' power is the key to change in education and schooling. It was so then, and it remains so now. Finally, school students have become the football of every party in government, and we allow them to wreck the life chances of far too many of our children. You as teachers have finally got your act together and are speaking powerfully with one voice. However, school students remain non-unionized, as do their parents and carers. I believe that the NEU needs to have serious discussions about what you yourselves will do about school exclusions, about corporate rather than educational leadership and management in schools, and how you would support the independent organization of school students like the Pimlico students and their parents, especially among the most vulnerable in the schooling system.
Thank you, Gus.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share a few comments from our viewers. One comment from Sarah. Thank you, Gus John. I have been learning from you and campaigning alongside you for justice in education for 50 years. Good to see you still fighting. That's a lovely message. Another message from Camille says, an honor to hear from you, Professor John. And Jackie says, we salute your continued consistent force within the struggle against racism. And nil exclusions, absolutely right, says Rob. Thank you very much. And one last comment from Lou Ann, who says, curriculum needs to be decolonized. We need a global mindset. Absolutely. Thank you very much. Okay, we are going to move on to our next speaker, who is Griffith Nguete. Griffith is an NEU rep and an English teacher. You're very welcome, Griffith.
Thank you. I'm really grateful to have been given the opportunity to speak at this Fringe about fighting for an anti-racist education. Education has a vital role in encouraging and enforcing change, and decolonising education is not a new fight. It's not a new fight, but a long one. What is evident now more than ever is just how essential and needed it is. Decolonising education means that we must challenge colonising practices that have influenced the past and which are still present today in education. We must all recognise that in the past, education was used as a means to form false assimilation and for colonial purposes. To decolonise education, we must confront what remains of these practices in our curriculum, ensuring that we are always considering whose knowledge and ways of knowing are given a priority. We need to start questioning why Henry VIII and the French Revolution is prioritised over students learning about their history, achievements and contributions of Black people in the UK. How many students know that Black people fought for Britain in World War II? Why do we never see any Black people in any of the mainstream images of war or in any of the materials we use to teach the students about war? Why have we been erased? What message does this send to our students? Additionally, it's vital for students to understand how the legacy of the slave trade has created many of the social injustices we see today. It's unfair to constantly expose students to narrow and biased perspectives of their history. Black people do not only have a history of enslavement, but we also have a history of strength, solidarity, and power. Multiple viewpoints and histories need to be taught, especially in regards to the British Empire. And people need to begin to question where the knowledge we teach our students actually comes from. Whose viewpoint does it come from? Whose ideas does it come from? Who wrote that perspective of history? And why is there so much missing and so much inaccuracy? Education is such a powerful tool that can influence young people's hearts, emotions, minds, beliefs, and that influence can last a lifetime. Therefore, we need to be mindful of what we teach. A teaching resource was suggested in the Race Commission's report, and we need to be ready to ask questions. It's our duty to teach the truth and correct misconceptions. And whilst I acknowledge the skill of Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare and would never suggest banning them, I also acknowledge that it would be helpful for students not to study the same white male voices continuously throughout their years in education. Students need to see themselves reflected in what we teach them. They need to know their voices, and voices like theirs also have made contributions to society and continues to do so. I've said this before, but whenever we talk about education failing our students, we always talk about exclusions, exams, behaviour systems, and I'm not denying that, but I do strongly believe that teaching a whitewashed history is failing our students. If we continue to allow the curriculum to marginalise them and prevent them from feeling a sense of belonging, and if we continue not to confront the assumptions of white superiority that is present in our curriculum, we fail our students. A distinction needs to be drawn between diversity and decolonising. Replacing books and adding textbooks is not enough. We need to think about who the main characters in our textbooks are, who has the voice, who's presented as the villain, who's presented as a victim. Diversity includes people, whereas decolonisation re-educates them. And we need to step back and think about each text we teach and each textbook that we are allowing to be taught. I always use Crooks as an example of Mice and Men, because most people have read the text. Crooks is always presented as submissive, an oppressed Black man who suffers mercilessly, cruelly at the hands of white men and women. He's also presented to be saved by a white man who prevents him from being hung. Crooks lives in a stable with the horses and is described in a degrading manner to demonstrate the treatment of Black people during this period. If you teach your students about Crooks in that way that I've just spoken to you about him, what message will you be giving your students about Black people, about Black men, about white people, about racism and about themselves? Ultimately, we need to start decolonising rather than just recognising. We need to think about the representation of each person that is in our texts. I genuinely believe the cure for racism is education, as racism is taught, and we have the ability to help to unteach it. But ultimately, we all need to work together in solidarity to ensure that when our students leave school, they leave with a sense of belonging, and they also know that we care, and they're also able to break the cycle. Thank you.
Excellent points to end on. Thank you very much, Griffiths. I've got a comment from Katrina who says, great questions from Griffiths. And I've got another comment from Janet, who's in Haringey. She says, absolutely right, Griffiths. I was in my 50s before I discovered Black, Indian and Chinese, i.e. people from the empire, fought in the Second World War. Shocking level of ignorance built into the education system. And another comment is, we certainly need to end the domination of old white men in the English curriculum. And that's from Janet. Okay, thank you very much for your contributions. We have over 400 people watching this meeting now. Please do feel free to share the link. We've got a few more excellent speakers coming up as well. We're hoping to end as close to 6 as possible, but I'm sure you're enjoying the speakers and we don't want to rush them too much. So please keep sharing the link so we can get more people viewing our meeting. Okay, moving on to our next speaker. It is Daniel Kebede, the Senior Vice President of the NEU. Daniel, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Venda, and thank you very much, Stand Up to Racism, for hosting this meeting. And I just don't know how I can follow these superb speakers, Professor John, Diane, Reem, and the story of Pimlico, absolutely inspirational, and Griffiths, of course. So it's a real pleasure to be here. There is no institutional racism. I saw a tweet about this government's report, and it said that this is nothing but state propaganda. And actually, I think that is completely correct. It is nothing more than state propaganda to imply that there is no such thing as institutional racism in Britain. We only have to look at Britain's history, but we can also just look at the present day, can't we? Black boys 5 times more likely to be excluded from school. They're 156 times more likely to be excluded from school if they're Black, on special needs and in receipt of free school meals. There is still a Black attainment gap, and the reality is for many Black children, they live a life of poverty. And Kevin talked about Black children, global majority children, facing 2 barriers, and he's absolutely correct that often that is poverty, and that is of course racism. For Bangladeshi children, 60% of Bangladeshi children live in poverty, a horrifying statistic. But what causes people to live in poverty? We can't separate out racism and poverty. The two are joined because of racism. Global majority people will often be in more precarious jobs on 0-hour contracts, be sacked and end up be disciplined at work and end up unemployed. But the link between racism and poverty cannot be denied. And of course, we see racism very much in our schools. As Griffiths was talking about, the narrow curriculum that is whitewashed, that is Eurocentric, that denies Black children the ability to experience their histories and their realities in the classroom. But I think we should be confident as a union. I'm incredibly proud of the work that our union has done. We are an anti-racist union, and that can be seen through the activities that our members have taken a part in in recent years. Over the past 12 months, actually, I've had the honour to go around the country on Zoom, of course, to talk about decolonising education and the decolonising agenda. That is something that our union has brought to the fore, really, through the activities that we have been involved in. Of course, we have also been helped in that process by the people of Bristol when they toppled that that statue into the harbour. You know, that event taught people more about slavery than the British curriculum ever will. So we must continue to stand in solidarity with them. And of course, we had that huge Black Lives Matter solidarity webinar with the Reverend Jesse Jackson, with thousands of members taking part in that. We've got Black Lives Matter, the most prioritised motion at this year's conference, and throughout our activities over the last 12 months, we've been able to double the number of Black reps. So I'm really proud of the anti-racist work that our union has been involved in. And that is, and I also just left out there the fact that we have launched the anti-racist charter for schools back in June, and that is something that is starting to be embedded in schools around the country. So I do think we should be confident, but our struggles are far from over. This government is brutally racist. We've got the most diverse cabinet in history, but the most racist one is what we are facing. So we have to continue to be committed to that fight, standing together in the fight against racism, and our education system and our schools will continue to be a battleground. The root of racism, it comes from the top, doesn't it? And it's used by the powerful to divide black and white, to keep both of us down. So let's keep organising in our schools. Let's keep organising across the education system, and let's fight and organise for an education system that liberates all. So thank you very much, Venda. Thank you very much, Stand Up to Racism.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for those very, very positive messages. And you're absolutely right. We've got so much to be confident and positive about as well. And you're absolutely right. As educators, we should be making use of the anti-racism charter in all of our schools, and that is what our students deserve. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. It is Sabi Dalu, who is the co-convener of Stand Up to Racism. You're very welcome, Sabi.
Thank you, Venda. And I want to start by saying a big thank you to all of our speakers today. It's really, you know, such a great pleasure to listen to you all and be on the same platform as you all. And I want to say a big thank you to Kevin Courtney, Mary Boosted, and the NEU for all your support. I don't think we'd be able to campaign if it wasn't for the support that you give us. So thank you for that. Yeah, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. I think I agree with the point that Daniel made earlier, which is that it's a right-wing propaganda counterattack to the Black Lives Matter movement and to undermine the truth, which is that racism is a major factor in the cause of ethnic disparities. And not only that, but other factors like social class, geography, underlying health conditions, and so on, those factors are actually exacerbated by racism as well. So let's look at social class. So Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities are more likely to be working class than their white counterparts. They're disproportionately represented within the working class. So attacks on the working class, like austerity, and as we're seeing now in COVID, it disproportionately impact BAME communities because of racism. Similarly, geography, the fact that more BAME communities are more likely to live in overcrowded areas where there's a worse quality of living, worse air quality, that's because of racism. The fact that, you know, BAME communities are kept down in society, that's racism. Underlying health conditions, stress, and so on, that's because of racism as well. So it's such a propaganda right-wing ideological attack to try and claim that racism isn't a factor in these disparities. It's just a straightforward ideological attack, and it must be resisted. And thankfully, there's been such a big backlash against it, and quite right too. And it was also somewhat ironic, as many have mentioned, that the report was launched on the same day as Pimlico Academy were rising up against racism in education. So on the one hand, you had a report that was denying that there was racism or institutional racism in education. Then on the other hand, you had it quite demonstrated very clearly that the opposite was in fact the case. And thank you to Reem Kadhim for joining us today. We can always rely on young people and students to inspire us into taking action against racism. I also want to agree with a point that Diane Abbott made earlier, which is that the CRED report is an attempt to undermine the Stephen Lawrence inquiry and to roll back race relations to even a pre-Scarman era. So the Scarman report into the Brixton riots was into the Brixton riots was in 1981. And some of the recommendations in the CRED report are actually similar to those recommendations. I mean, that was 40 years ago, but even Scarman acknowledged that more must be done to actually tackle racism before it gets out of control. And so I think it's correct to say that it's rolling back race relations to even a pre-Scarman agenda and to underline the importance of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, which was very transformative, and to underline our commitment to campaigning for the implementation of very good reviews that we've had recently, like the Lamy review into the criminal justice system and the Angelini review into deaths in police custody. We need to have those recommendations implemented. And just finally, two very quick points. The point about slavery and the fact that the report contained sentences that monstrously prettified slavery, that's another ideological attack. That is an ideological attack following the Black Lives Matter movement, which meant that for the first time in history, British society was being forced to confront its shameful past. And it's an attempt to deny that racism today is linked to and is a legacy of slavery and colonialism. It is, and we have to say that, and we have to argue that consistently. And my final point is a point about COVID-19. We need a public inquiry like the Stephen Lawrence inquiry into the disproportionate impact of COVID. We have had report after report, research after research of very authoritative statisticians like the ONS and people in the medical profession talking about the role of racism and ethnic disparity. So it is completely shameful that the CRED report just ignored all of that. We want a public inquiry. We demand a public inquiry into the disproportionate impact of COVID on BAME communities, and we want all areas of racism in society, including education, and exactly what the Black Lives Matter movement has taught us. And we need all of that examined in a public inquiry. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sabi. A public inquiry, here, absolutely. Okay, I just want to say we've still got over 400 people viewing this meeting and lots of comments coming in. I'm sorry I can't read out all of the comments, but just something from June here. Trade unions are so important in today's hostile environment and austerity. I can't agree more, June. Thank you very much for those comments. Okay, we're going to move on to our last speaker. It is Weyman Bennett, co-convener of Stand Up to Racism. Thank you, Weyman.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank all the speakers for speaking so well about this problem. And in fact, leave me very little to say, actually, because you've all said it and said it so eloquently. But I do think that the report came out one day earlier than it should have done. It should have come out on April Fool's Day, because that's the only time that report should have been read or shared with anybody. But on a serious note, I think we have to just take two questions. Why did they produce the report? Because even if you sit down and you listen to the brilliant letter that came out today exposing it, There's no way. I don't, you know, the report people started off saying they want to prove the earth is flat, and they produced a report that says the earth is flat. But why did they do it? Why would they do this at this point? And I think we have to answer that question. And we have to accept that we're in the middle of an offensive, that the government is attacking us on three fronts. It's attacking us ideologically by trying to let people learn their place. It's the 40 years since the Brixton riots. I remember the Burnage report that was produced by Professor Gus John, which is what they're afraid of. 87% of this country is, they say, is majority white. The BLM did something that scared them. It showed it was a multiracial movement led by black generals, as what happened happened in Pimlico. They are used to pumping out racism and expecting to win. They were shocked that the majority of people agreed with BLM. That's why they're putting forward this ideological attack, and they're not going to stop. The fact that they're talking about removing people's right to protest is a combination of those things. When we produced a book, I won't go through the facts, as people have said about why they know that institutional racism exists. I want to talk about the fight against it and what they're trying to do. You see, I was in something called School Kids Against Nazis when Blair Peach was murdered by the police, and they said that he shared the same characteristic of black people of having a thin skull. That's why he was murdered. I saw the rise of Prevent, in which they tried to discriminate against Muslim. I've seen all these fights that they've put forward, but I think that these people are putting forward a much more determined fight. And we have to understand another complication. Usually, when I remember being a child involved in the riots, and they brought a man called William Whitelaw to tell us why we should remain in our state, a man called Sir William Whitelaw. Today, they roll out Priti Patel. In other words, one of the things that they're doing is putting forward Sewell, Priti Patel, Bad Enoch, in order to confuse the people that resist them by putting certain faces in order to make people learn their place. And we have to understand that's a difference between before, in terms of finding people that are prepared to lie about these things. So we have to prepare ourselves for that. I think we can do something about that as long as we understand it's not a one-off and they're not going to stop. The most chilling part of that report was saying we had to change the narrative of how people talk about fighting racism. That's not just a small accident. And I think one of the things that the NEU, the NET's done before, and what we've all done before, is we're going to have to organise resistance. And I think it's no accident that there was an attack on a women's vigil, that they're putting forward the bill, that they were putting forward a thing that says institutional racism doesn't exist. They're denying the impact of COVID. They know what's coming. And that's part of why they're trying to make sure that they stop us. What's brilliant, I think, is when you see Pimlico School, you see BLM, and you see those people come out and organise. And I think we have to renew our activities about this. To be honest, I've been coming to NUT for 25 years, and it's always been a good story. We beat the National Front by fighting. We beat the British National Party by fighting. The reason why we did that was because the schools were at the forefront. But we're in a much more serious fight because the institutions used to say that they wanted a more equal society, stuff like that. They accepted it, a pluralistic society. They've rejected that. And I think that means that we have to redouble our effort about how we do that. We have to give solidarity to all the people resistant, and we have to give solidarity to ourselves. I want to thank the NEU. I want to thank all the people. And I also want to go back to what Professor John just gone said. I was a child when those conferences about were taking place. Today I'm a black parent, I've been a black educator, and I've seen all those things. I don't want what happened to me as a child to happen to my 14-year-old son now. And I'm afraid, I have to say, I'm not confident that that's an automatic given. I think we have to make sure that a generation who had their lives stopped by the police, picked on as second-class citizens, that doesn't happen again. And also, I think it's important that we understand they don't get away with dividing black and white because they're aiming for trying to split those people, because that's the force that's going to hold them to account. What they're afraid of is black generals leading white working-class people together in a unified way of defeating them. And I think we ought to give them that nightmare. I think that's what we need to give to people like Boris Johnson. We're not grinning pickaninnies. We're not bank robbers. We're people that resist with not just 1 year of resistance, but 300 years of resistance. And that is what will defeat you. And that's what we need to celebrate and make sure it's part of our curriculum and our activity.
Thank you so much, Weyman. Really, really inspiring words there, very powerful. Absolutely, as you say, let's redouble our efforts going forward. Lots of messages of support from YouTube and on Facebook as well. I'm sorry, I don't have time to read out all of the messages. I just want to thank all the speakers tonight. I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say they have all been inspiring and also very thought-provoking as well. I just want to thank Stand Up to Racism for organising this meeting. And it's fantastic to see the NEU and Stand Up to Racism working together. I did ask Reem if she wants to say a few words. I thought it might be nice to hear from Reem again. So I'm going, she said only if I have a question. So I'm going to ask Reem, what message, Reem, would you like to give to the government? And we will close the meeting with your words.
I'd like to give the message that your attempts to constantly silence the individuals that have been oppressed and have been talking out about their oppression is not going to work. Pimlico Academy is an example of young people standing up against the wrong, the injustice that we are seeing being done to us, being done to our families, injustice that has been around for so long, and it's about time we change that. Yeah, definitely don't underestimate the power of young people, the power of everybody, especially protest. We will continue to fight. We will continue to stand up against injustice that we see until there has been a change. And your reports saying things such as, oh, it doesn't exist, and trying to dismiss us is not going to, well, I'm not going to read that report and go, oh, okay, my bad. And we won't stop until the issue has been solved. Thank you.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, you know, what can I say? I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I say, when we look at students like Reem, I think the future looks promising. And as Weyman said, let's redouble our efforts. We're obviously doing something right when they've got to write a report denying everything we're doing. So have a lovely evening, everyone, and thank you very much for attending tonight.
Right.